Welcome back to Capital H. I am Kyle Forrest, one of your hosts, and today we have returning guests, Stacia, Garr, and Dani Johnson from RedThread Research, who joined us earlier in the year to discuss their 2025 megatrends and to dig into their recent event, Elevate, that took the megatrends and really brought a group of people through some forward, future-looking scenarios that could shape the world of work, the world of HR, and really prepare leaders with some tangible actions that can be taken now to prepare for those futures. So I'm really thrilled to dig in, to do a mid-year check on the mega trends, to learn more about Elevate and share those insights and findings with you all, and to take a look at the back half of the year because plenty has happened since the mega trends were published, and that's to say the least. So Stacia and Dani, it's great to have you both back on Capital H.
It's good to be here. Great to be here, Kyle.
Share a little bit about Elevate itself, right? I know this was a labor of love, and that's to say it lightly, maybe some blood, sweat, and tears thrown in there as well. But what was your goal with bringing Elevate to life and using that as a forum to also bring the megatrends to life?
The thing about Elevate was it really was supposed to be a embodiment of everything that RedThread is, right? So high quality, unbiased research, working at the cutting edge of topics that people really care about but need some guidance around and ambiguity, and then a fantastic community. And that is completely what we got, was those three things. And you were all kind of smiling. People can't see that on the podcast, but for those of you who weren't there, it was an amazing experience. The energy from the very first cocktail hour of people who were just thrilled to be in the mountains and to get a chance to connect. And by the end, it was less than 48 hours. People were hugging each other and talking about how they were going to meet up afterwards. You know, we got the survey results back. We just went over them as a team. And there was no one who said that they made fewer than 3 connections at the event. And we actually had almost 20% of people say they made more than 10 new connections at the event, which is that was a big part of our goal, was that connection and community.
Yeah. And one of the things, I'll give Ashley Goodall a little shout out, that is the line that stuck with me is at the end of it saying, I had no mediocre conversations across 2 days, which is my new favorite stamp of quality for an event. But Dani, I'd love to have you share a little bit more about it as well, because it was everything Stacia just shared is the embodiment of RedThread, but you all were then very intentional with how do you design the flow, the content you use, the facilitation. There was no standing on the stage speakers. There was no fireside chat panels, right? This was a roll up your sleeves and engage type of event.
Yeah, it definitely was. And it's what Stacia and I wanted from the beginning. We go to so many conferences and they all start sounding the same. And a lot of them have the same speakers and you experience the same sort of thing. And people duck out to check their email and all kinds of things. And we wanted to make sure that these 2 days were really valuable for those people that attended. And that's what we got. So we did just really small things. Like you mentioned, we didn't have any tracks. The very first person that helped us sort of decide how we were going to run this conference was like, okay, what are your tracks? And we're like, we don't have any. And they're like, how are you going to do this without tracks? Every single vendor that we talked to had a really hard time sort of imagining the thing that we wanted. But we were able to do it without tracks. We did it with small conversations. We did it with opportunities to connect and chances to think about the future differently and sharing and connecting. And it was, seriously, it fed my soul. I'm not super effusive with words ever, but that 2 days fed my soul. And I think a lot of it was the insistence that Stacia and I had that it was going to be different and it was going to feel different.
Yeah. Well, and part of what in my mind was so powerful about it was the ability to ground on the megatrends and then look forward, right? Maybe Dani, I'll start with you, but can you just frame again for folks, what are the mega trends, right? And then, for you and Stacia to say, what were some of the things you designed into the agenda to say, how do we get people to think differently about this, understanding where could these be going?
Yeah. So the megatrends, every year, Stacia and I look at the world and try to determine the things that are going to affect how organizations use their people. We don't ground on HR types of things or technology types of things. We think that's kind of a waste of time. We actually go bigger. So what are the big things that are truly going to affect people and organizations. And those things this past year, this November, which we still think we took a look at them before this conference just to make sure, but they're still very, very top of mind. First one is geopolitical unrest or uncertainty. There's a lot of that going around and that affects organizations. The second one is I'm drawing a blank right now.
More growth, less people focus.
More growth, less people focus. For the first time in a pretty long time, people focus has fallen to number 5 in the list of things
CEO priorities.
CEOs care about. Yeah. The third one is power struggle. We're still seeing a major power struggle between organizations and their employees. The fourth one is, the ongoing 10-year skills discussion. We don't have the right skills, and we now have fewer people entering the workforce. And so not only do we have fewer people, but they don't have the right skills. And so how do we fix that problem? And then the final one was AI. And what we've seen in the last year and a half is less focus on experimentation and much more focus on, okay, now what do we do with it?
Yep.
So how do we implement that stuff?
Yeah.
So that's kind of where we started, and then we kind of took it from there.
Yeah. And so Stacia, maybe, you and Dani helped for people frame up those mega trends and the data underlying it. And then that pulled into some activities. So you want to share a little bit about after the mega trends were framed, where did you challenge people to go next with some future forward thinking?
Yeah, so we did a few things. One is we had, even during the Megatrends session, we had our co-facilitators, Lisa K. Solomon from the D School and Jeffrey Rogers from Trajectory, talk about or kind of pull out from people how they were feeling. And we have these pictures of folks when we were doing this. They had these great cards that were, red, yellow, green, and black if it was really bad. And people were showing those cards and how they felt about them, and then talking and sharing throughout even the megatrends. So I think that did a really nice job of helping people feel like, okay, I understand where we are as a community here in this room. And then from there, Lisa K. Solomon and Jeff said, hey, that's great. We now need to figure out, what does that mean? And so they talked a lot about not just a future, but many futures. And what are the types of futures that our organization is assuming is happening or is going to happen, and what might some alternatives be? Yeah. So we started that work by first looking at what's called a futures wheel, which is basically going through and saying, okay, if this is the core problem or the core thing we're trying to solve, what are the first level, second level, and third level implications or third order implications of this? And just trying to get people out of their heads, right? We think there's just one potential future, and there's just not. And there are all these consequences that often we don't think about when we say, oh, we're going to go in this direction. So that was the first step. We then moved into the scenarios, which we can talk about more. But I think one of the things people told us in the feedback afterwards, as well as in the room, was, I have never thought about the problem in kind of this really structured way and all the different permutations around it.
Yeah. I mean, it was a fascinating exercise for me to sit at a table and go through with people, because how often do you stop at just the first effect, right? Here's the problem, here you go, right? How do I then solve for that? Yeah, I just keep going, knocking down the next whack-a-mole, so to speak, right? And I'm not being thoughtful to say, if I take this action, then it might be this, then it might be this, right? And thus, how am I using that to steer where I go, right? And I know part of the messaging as well was, no organization ever is going to scenario plan for everything, nor be able to take action in a way that prevents everything. But just by going through the exercise, which is not a lengthy exercise to go through, you can make better decisions and choices, right? Which was one of my takeaways as well. How are people taking this type of frame away from Elevate and bringing it to their organization to just make better decisions at large, that much faster, in a way that's informed with, here's the trade-offs and considerations I'm driving towards. So it was an eye-opening exercise to go through.
Yeah, we found it was too. Two things that stood out to me when we were doing those exercises. The first one is we invited people from all the different functions. So it wasn't a learning conference, wasn't a people analytics conference, and we mixed everyone up. So everybody was sitting with people that didn't necessarily think the way that they did or have the same sorts of things that they needed to do. And so that was really interesting in sort of the mixing up of things. The other thing is, when you follow more than one future down and you see how you can solve those different futures, you start to gel on things that can be done across. I think Lisa and Jeff called them no regrets things that we should do. So regardless of the future that's coming up, what are the no regrets things that we should be focusing on to get us where we need to go?
Yeah. And Dani, elaborate for folks as well. It wasn't just like professionals in the room who were across from different functions, but you had academics, you had thought leaders, you had CHROs, you had heads of functions, different sizes and organizations. So it was truly a mix of people, and you all curated that, right? So it was people who would like show up and engage and share. And it's one of those things that the way in which you articulated some things, like you were looking for people who were willing to share their time and their effort, who are actively working on this, right? No one invited was going to sit in the room and be a quiet participant for 48 hours, which I think was also unique.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. There were so many great people, but we had a very clear target audience. And a big part of it was their ability to take these insights, to be open to the conversation, to lean in, and then to be able to go back and do something about it in their organization. And it wasn't a passive listening event. It was for people who were leaning forward into this already and who would continue to lean forward into it afterwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So Stacia, you noted first future wheel, right? Exercise. And then actually took the mega trends and played it into 4 different future scenarios, right? And got people to dig into if this, right? If you're, one of the axes, right, was AI realizes its potential or AI disappoints, right? Other axes, geopolitical uncertainty continues to be highly volatile, or we get to some stability, right? And those then quadrants became an exercise. And I'll get a shout out to my Fortress economics, folks, and the scenario that we played through and talking about bringing pensions back. But maybe give a little flavor for how you all kind of crafted that as well with Lisa Kay and Jeffrey, and where that really also got people pushing their thinking as well for thinking about the future and what they can do about that for their organizations.
Yeah. Well, one thing I have to say before I dive into that, Kyle, is how much it makes me smile that you remember the axes, you remember your group. That's a statement to the power, because we're now, almost a month later from the event, and you still have it in there. So that's awesome.
Yeah.
So it was, like any good consultants, we had a 2x2. And we had folks in those different areas. And the idea was, again, to push on that there's no single future. There are multiple potential futures and that you can think through, but also you can limit, you can create a scope around it, right? So if you think, we had 5 megatrends, these are only 2 of them that we put on axes. But if you think about the things you think are most likely to happen, right? You can still place some bets. And for us, we thought these 2 were the most likely to impact organizations in a very meaningful way. And so that's why we chose those 2. There's all sorts of options.
Right.
But the point was, don't think too narrow, but also don't think too big. And therefore, we put people on these 2x2s. And you're right, what came out was fascinating. So in Fortress Economy, which is AI under-delivers, and we have global volatility increasing, we saw things, yes, pensions, but also general themes around resilience needs to be operationalized. We need to see more mentorship and institutional knowledge. We are also going to potentially face knowledge loss that if AI in particular is under-delivering, we're not going to be able to capture. So things like that in that group. But when we then contrast that with another group like the one that I was in, which was the networked renaissance, which is AI delivers and global cooperation stabilizes. I love that. Yeah. I randomly got assigned that group. I was like, yes, this is awesome. But in that group, we were talking about, abundance increasing what we called the cost of confusion. So there being this sense that, because AI is delivering, we've got global cooperation, we can do anything, but what do we do? Collaboration becoming a differentiator in terms of how do you actually bring everything to life and make your organization more successful, et cetera. But the point being, there's these different futures, and depending on where you think the bets are or where you think things are going to potentially go, that can then determine the activities that you should then take.
It was also really interesting to me. I think I had a high volatility, high AI. So AI delivers and you're in a high volatility. It was really interesting to talk to people in different industries and see their takes on it. So some of them were super excited about that because it gave them opportunities to sort of rip things up. And some of them were like, well, what the heck are we going to do if AI actually does turn out? It was fascinating to be like, okay, yeah. So even within the thing, you have preconceived notions, especially of a Foursquare, but there were pros and cons to each of them. And those pros and cons were specific to the industry and sometimes even the company that they were in.
Which I think goes back to the way in which you had the attendees, because at the table that I was sitting at, there was a CHRO from a state government who was talking about the things that they're doing within their state for HR function, how do they support agencies, et cetera. But they're really confined to employees in the state. Now, the state itself has considerations for what is happening with all these trends. And thus, how do you think about all those different, and that gets back to the first order, second order, third order effects, right, of the problem from the first exercise, and where do different organizations have to tackle things depending on where they are, right? So another individual at the table, global company, right? Well, they have very different considerations in the short term relative to geopolitical events that are happening, depending on where their employees are located around the world, and therefore, how do they have to respond to that much faster, right? So it was really interesting to see who prioritized what, or who's tackling what, kind of like in the now, near, next framing a little bit. And then, yes, the commonalities across some of them relative to, as this potential future plays out, what might be a beneficial tactic to help still drive mission, vision, value, business strategy, et cetera. So it was pretty fascinating to see how all that played out.
A lot of our participants, I felt like, were reasonably comfortable with the range of potential AI scenarios.
Yeah.
But the global instability one was one that, at least in the groups that I kind of was talking to, felt they didn't fully know what to do with it.
Yeah.
And I think they hadn't had a chance to really grapple with it. And as I kind of, in some of my conversations, push people, they'd be like, oh, and that's where I saw the real divergence of opinions, because I think there's almost been kind of a solidifying of, okay, these are the things we should think about with AI, which is great. We weren't there 2 years ago. But on this global instability one, it is so fresh and so present, though. It actually was, when we again got the survey results back, it was the one that people felt was the most relevant to them of all the different megatrends. And so it's just kind of been interesting to see them start to really grapple with that in a new way.
Yeah. When you all teed things up at the start, digging back into some of the data that was informing the megatrends, 58% of CHROs felt equipped to deal with a natural disaster. 28% or 26% or some number around there were equipped to deal with a geopolitical event, right?
Yeah. And not only that, I mean, tariffs weren't on anyone's radar until like February or March, right? Like, it didn't even hit any of the surveys that were out there about what are you worried about. And now it's a very big concern to the majority of the organizations that attended.
Yeah, absolutely. So great conversation. I think people dug in. What were then, as you kind of got to the end of the event, and even you all now reflecting on this almost a month later, the feedback, the continued conversations, what were a few kind of the big themes, insights, where you really were like, this is something new that I'd now dug my teeth into, or wow, like someone made me think differently through the conversation on that front?
I think for me, one of the biggest ones were how many leaders are actually reconsidering the structure of HR. So we have been talking about it for a while, but we heard leaders in the room come up with this and be like, well, is it even a function anymore? Does it take a different sort of like, you know what I mean? And that's incredibly disruptive. And that requires an awful lot of thinking about what the future is going to do. I was thrilled that we're finally seeing organizations sort of go there because we think we're going to have to. And this felt really proactive.
Yeah.
I would add to that, not just how is HR structured, but what is the purpose of HR was an underlying theme of all that, And I feel like that's a conversation we've in general been having where people, there's these doomsday folks out there who are like, all of HR is going to get automated by, agents, and agents are going to do it all and all the rest of that. And it's interesting that's a doomsday take, right? Because one, that implies that the only value HR has had has been things like responding to benefits questions and, creating dashboards and stuff. And, all of us here do not believe that's the case, right? We know and understand that HR can do so much more. But I think what it does is it strikes at an potentially underlying fear that folks have, which is that if suddenly they do have the time now to be strategic and to make that strategic impact, they may not yet know how to do that. Yep. And so I think that that gets at this nub of the concern, the maybe second or third level order concern in our futures wheel. And so I think that question about what is the purpose of HR and are we ready to take on that future is one of the biggest takeaways for me from the entire event.
In terms of what both of you shared, one of the things maybe I'll say to those of you listening who are HR professionals, this was a conversation about more than just HR as well. Because there were people saying, if we were starting a business today in the middle of 2025, would I need the functions as constituted that businesses have? IT, legal, procurement, marketing, sales, HR, right? And it happens to be, yes, folks in the room, many representing the HR profession, but talking about business broadly, like, where does business go, right? Because certainly one of the themes of AI is to maximize its potential is you need to break down barriers between data sources. And as you do that, you start to blend topics and conversations and outputs and outcomes in a way that changes the roles of people. But I think also to your point, Stacia, around like the strategic bit is what looked like a strategic role in 23, 24 might look very different in 26, 27. So it doesn't mean that people can't continue to be strategic and drive strategic value and outcomes and impact on the business, but it's also acknowledging like to be human is to grow. To be strategic is to continue to evolve with all the different things impacting businesses and organizations. And this is just a moment in time people have to acknowledge, like being comfortable with ambiguity, with uncomfortableness, and just lean into the fact that things will change and that's okay. And this is our opportunity to also like show people what it's like to lead through change.
And I think the other part of that, Kyle, is understanding that it is an opportunity to lead through the change. One of the other big themes that came out of the event was folks' concern with executive buy-in and getting executives to support various initiatives, whether that be how we think about AI, how we think about humanness, how we think about the redesign of HR, how we think about breaking down data. Like it was just this constant theme in the conversations. And then we did this really cool exercise where we had folks at the end of day one write down a question that was still on their mind, leave it on their table on a sticky note, and then had everybody sit in a different place the next day so that people could see what other folks had on their mind. And we went around and looked at those, and we were, I wouldn't say shocked, but certainly a bit taken aback by the level of concern around executive buy-in and getting executives to see some of these things as problems. And so Dani and I ourselves actually just did a podcast with somebody yesterday where what jumped out at us was this idea that as an HR leader, you need to have the confidence to believe that you can go from point A to point B and make the journey better, and to lean into that. And that means that you lean in. Yes, you need to get your executive buy-in, but there are ways you can lead throughout in any organization you're in. And so that kind of dichotomy of needing executive ownership and yet still needing to lead on your own was a big thing that came to me.
Yeah, I love that. So as we look forward into the back half of the year, you both acknowledged the mega trends from November 24 to then publishing in early 25, they're all still incredibly relevant, and maybe even more so from the start of the year, depending on the trend. What's on your radar for the back half of the year? Or what are some things that you're paying attention to that might form the basis of the next version of the mega trends in early 26?
I think for me, two things. First of all, AI. And I hate to say AI because everybody and their dog is saying AI right now. But we started the conversation about there's less experimentation and there's more sort of diving in and figuring out what it can do for the organization. Along with that, we've seen sort of a parallel trend, which is, are we augmenting the human or are we fixing the system to begin with? If you look at some of our people systems over 100 years, they have a lot of Band-Aids on them, right? But can we use AI to actually fix some of those systems and use AI more strategically in organizations? So that's the AI one. The other one has to do with structure. So if we are restructuring, and this might be recency bias, I'm in the middle of an L&D structure study right now, but what does it look like in the future, right? Are they still standalone silos? Stacia and I have said no for the last 7 years. Or are they sort of more strategic action teams that make sure that things happen in the systems and processes that actually are used to get the work done? And that's a completely different skill set. It's a different structure. It's a different everything. How can we actually rethink HR, not just kind of tweak it a little bit so that it fits the new thing, but how can we completely rethink HR and some of the functions that exist under it to help organizations move forward?
Yeah, Dani, the one thing I'll say briefly on the L&D and the structure one, and then Stacia, I'll go to you. I had a chat with Brandon Carson the other day, who was like talking about the evolution of chief learning officers and learning function, and I said, and then tying that to things like the creation of the cloud, right? And other macro things. And I said, what's really fascinating is organizations have actually leaned more into learning, you could argue, because now you've got sales enablement teams and customer enablement teams and partner enablement teams and all this learning, but it's moved away from the traditional central L&D, yet in so doing has introduced its own range of problems for companies, right? Now I've got dozens of L&D systems inside my company, and we're creating content that you can use for employees and customers and partners that could, have reasonable 80% connectivity overall. So how do you evolve some of this and acknowledge that every company is in the business of learning, whether that's for their end customer or, a professional or whatever it may be, but people don't explicitly acknowledge that and therefore structure themselves around how do they drive those learning outcomes in a different way. It was an interesting conversation, which I imagine you will shed some more light on as the L&D structure plays out.
Yeah, no, we're definitely seeing that. And we're even seeing it in the technology that supports learning within organizations. A lot of times it's not coming from traditional L&D vendors anymore. And so a lot of the learning is being jump-started by the business functions, and they're using different types of tools. And so what does that mean for a traditional L&D function that only wants to do the traditional things and is sort of doubling down on that? That's the entire HR sort of structure, people structure in organizations. It's not just L&D, but it's an interesting use case.
Yeah. All right, Stacia, what's on your mind for the back half of the year?
A few things. So diving more deeply into the AI conversation and how do we think through the integration of AI in a more practical sense, like more of a roadmap to, okay, like here's how you actually break this thing apart. Like think about this. And not just think about this, but like these are the questions to ask yourself. These are the trade-offs to think through in these different places. These are the different kind of risk profiles. I just feel like coming out of it, there was a lot of like, okay, I've got a better sense of what could be or what the future could be, but now how do I get started? And so I want to spend some time working on that and sharing what we're seeing, and then also just some general guidance on what seems to make sense potentially from previous experiences. I think, Kyle, I'm a historian. I have 2 degrees in history. And so I like to go back and find other examples of things and how we've adjusted and what worked and didn't. So that's one big thing. The other thing goes back to people analytics and data. So right now I'm in the middle of a skills data architecture study, which is really about how do we stitch these systems together so that we can get information about skills in all the right places. But that is almost a microcosm of this question of how do we get data together so that we can power some of these AI systems so that we have information in the right places and with the right information, et cetera. So we're doing the skills data architecture study because it feeds a lot of the other stuff, but I think it's also kind of undergirding what we will know in the future about how to think about these data systems.
Yeah. You bringing up Stacia, the historian comment, reminded me of Jeffrey's question, like who's taken a history class? Everyone raises their hand. Who's taken a futures class? Like one person raised their hand. And one of my takeaways from Elevate was there is tremendous value from learning from history, but we need to also take the futures class, so to speak, or learn how to use some of these tools to do some more holistic thinking, do some scenario planning and modeling. And it's not something that takes you days and weeks to do, but by understanding the framework, you can drive to better quality decisions, right? Because you've showed a completeness of thinking and first, second, third order effects or understanding how things might play out. So I'd love to hear from each of you, like, what was kind of one key takeaway for you, or like things that you heard from others to take away is like, I'm leaving this and I'm putting something into action at my organization?
It was a shocking one for me. But I think for me, it was the juxtaposition of having so many smart leaders in a room, building connections, and then talking about AI. That was so interesting to me because we're talking about, people are being replaced with AI and all these types of things. And it just reinforced to me the importance of the humans and why we're doing this in the first place. Lisa has a book out there, which is great, and we think you should read it. It's about designing experiences that help people get to where they need to go. And this is a use case for Stacia and I to sort of take that and be like, yes, this is absolutely necessary. But it was overwhelming to me, the importance of people and rooms in the same room with ideas, being vulnerable, talking about the things that really matter to them and what can help their organizations in a way that I haven't felt for quite a while.
I think the biggest takeaway I had was we are working in a world where everyone is saying faster, more, shorter timelines, like the 5-year plan is out, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And taking just the little bit of space that we did in time to step back and say, okay, we're going to put that world on hold for a little bit. And we're going to think about what's really happening around us. Like, what is the water we're swimming in? And how do we swim best in it? Not saying we're making a 3-year plan, but we're going to understand the dynamics and use those dynamics as guideposts to make better decisions amongst the crazy, right? So it was a different kind of medium or middle way between the old school 5-year strategic plan, blah, 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 and what I feel like so many of us are living with all the swirling, just make a decision and move on because your competition is going to move faster and you've got AI, blah. It was like, okay, let's do this. And for me, the value of that was incredible. So one other thing I wanted to mention, Kyle, as a big takeaway was just this sense of optimism. There's so much negativity in the news, and it feels like there's so much fear right now. And we started there, right? When Jeffrey asked the question, how are you feeling about some of this stuff? And everyone's like, worried or concerned. And one person said optimistic. And I remember Jeffrey's quip was, have you read the news? But by the end of the 2 days, I think there was this recognition, one, that other people are working on these problems who are super smart and thinking hard about them and trying to build a better future. But then also we have this community of people to build that future with. And this sense that we can influence the future if we grab hold of it and think about it and do something. I had someone come up to me who was like, this week has filled my soul.
Yeah.
I had another person come up to me who said, this is the best event I've been to in 30 years, and I go to multiple events a year. It really seemed to hit this place of need. And for listeners, I would just encourage you, try to create those spaces for optimism because it's hard right now, but we can intentionally do it, and it's there.
Hey, Kyle, you asked us a lot what we took away and what we think is coming in the next year. I'd love to understand, of those 2 days, what were the takeaways for you?
Yeah. Well, I think, Dani and Stacia, for me, there's 3 things that I'll say. One, I'll go back to your point around the human connection. And because it was people from, again, academics, CHROs, leaders of functions, state and local government, private sector, et cetera. And we are all better together, right? There's no reason why we can't work more frequently across organizations and levels and things to drive outcomes for humans. So that was one. The second was the optimism piece. One of my favorite phrases is positive mindset brings positive outcomes. And if you're not seeing the hope or opportunity amidst the uncertainty, that's not a fun place to be, right? But sometimes it takes a little bit of work, which is why it's helpful to have people to do the work with so that you can share the load together. And I think the third was many people, when they think about the future, think it's too far away, or it feels too theoretical, or it feels too academic. And the whole thing that you all, with Lisa, Kay, and Jeffrey, forced everyone to do is get it to be tangible. How do I take these scenarios and think about, is it probabilistic or possible? How possible? How probable? What is a tangible thing I can do now? So for people out there thinking about, I'm never going to become a futurist, yes, you can. Just make sure that you then end your futuristic thinking by saying, what is the thing I can do today to actually make incremental progress on the problem? And I think maybe, I'll throw in a fourth. For everyone, as you go back into fall conference season and other events and things, it is like Stacia said, like if you have to do it, create the lunch, create the dinner, bring some people together where you're actually making the space for conversation. And yes, you're going to hear great stories from panels and speakers and other things. But if you don't bring that into dialogue and then contextualize it for your business or whatever challenges you're talking on, those remain as great stories and not always like insights that can help you meaningfully move forward. So make sure that you are making the space for conversation.
I love that advice.
Yeah. One of the ways that we tried to make it very real and tangible from the very first session was Jeff Rogers' 3-2-1 model. So I'm just going to share that for folks here because I think it's actually a useful way to think about going to conferences, which I had never heard before. And the 3-2-1 model was that you come away with 3 new friends, 3 people you would actually call or email if you have a challenge, that you come up with 2 new ideas that you didn't have before, that you think, okay, this might be something that could impact my business, and then 1 actual experiment you're going to go back and run at your company. So I think if you can go to every event and achieve the 3-2-1 model, it will have been worth your time.
Yeah, it's like the 1% better every day, right?
Yeah.
Like tangible progress over the course of the year. Well, Stacia and Dani, thank you both for joining Capital H again. Listeners, if you did not catch the episode earlier in the year tied to the 2025 megatrends, strongly suggest you go listen to it to get some more context on those so that you can have some more basis for this. And again, Stacia and Dani, just thank you so much for joining to have another phenomenal conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Kyle.
This podcast is produced by Deloitte. The views and opinions expressed by podcast speakers and guests are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of Deloitte. This podcast provides general information only and is not intended to constitute advice or services of any kind. For additional information about Deloitte, please go to deloitte.com/about.